We've certainly got big differences between the parties. I think it's worth starting actually thinking about what's in the manifestos just by saying that everything about the economics and public finances of the next 5 years is incredibly uncertain. Not that you'd know it from looking at the manifestos, because there are some lots of specifics in there, or at least specifics in some of them. But not much acknowledgement of the fact that we don't have much idea, actually, what's going to happen over the next 5 years. Whoever wins, and whatever happens with Brexit, there's lots of uncertainty around what impact that's going to have on the economy and the public finances. Don't forget, as we often do, there's a big wide world out there, which, economically speaking, was doing pretty well until until earlier this year, and we lost out on a lot of that growth. But it's slowing down. We've got trade wars between China and the US. And even if you ignore all of that, as the OBR are always very cheerfully reminding us, we get a recession about once every 10 years, and it's about 10 years since the last recession. So whether we get another one over the next Parliament remains to be seen. And if we do, of course, quite a lot of stuff might get blown well off course. What are the Conservatives saying? Well, in their manifesto, remarkably little, I think it's fair to say, on public finances, spending and tax. I think we said, and I think we'd certainly stand by that if this had been a one-year budget, we'd have described it as pretty modest. As a programme for government, it's really, for 5 years, there's really remarkably little in it. I mean, to a first approximation, no additional current spending. And the biggest tax announcement is that there'll be no change to income tax, national insurance, and VAT rates. There is room for some fairly significant additional investment spending there. That's all a little unfair to the Conservatives, because there is some significant spending increases coming down the line as a result of the spending review and the extra money given to the NHS last year. So spending in a couple of years' time will be about 30 billion more than it is today. So in that sense, austerity at an end, no further cuts planned, and public service spending a little bit higher by 2023 than it was in 2010. Not that that's an awful lot to write home about after more than a decade. Though public service spending outside of health will still be way down on where it was in 2010, 15% lower by 2023 on those plans than it was in 2010. So some real increases, but in a sense, those were all pre-announced, and there's very little additional in the manifesto. You take all of that at face value, and you get the deficit, the debt, pretty steady at roughly where they are, which is pretty much what you might think of most of the Conservative manifesto, bar Brexit, which is steady as she goes, not much change. Of course, risks around what would happen as a result of no deal, if that's where we end up in a year's time. So I think, lots of questions there. Would we really have a government doing as little as is in that manifesto? I think the answer is probably not. So what would actually happen? I think a lot unknowns. Labour couldn't be much more different. The scale of the tax and spending plans, it's hard to overstate. They really are extremely big. So just to throw some big numbers at you, current spending increases 80 billion a year. This is on top of the 30-odd billion already coming through. Investment spending, an extra 55 billion a year on average over a parliament. That's doubling government investment spending. Tax increases of 80 billion a year. Another 60 billion magicked out somewhere to pay the so-called WASPy women, those who saw their pension ages increase over the last decade. So by all British historical standards, astonishing and unprecedented levels of tax and spending increases. It's important to put that in international context, though. If you take the overall spending plans, they would take us from relatively low by Western European standards to rather more average by Western European standards as tax and spending as a fraction of national income. So unprecedented in UK history, but not unprecedented in terms of international comparison. On those spending plans, where's all that money going? I think the answer, in a sense, is it's largely going to a reimagined and more universal welfare state. So free higher education, free childcare, free personal care, free prescriptions, and free quite a lot, free TV licenses, free quite a lot of other things. This is actually not a manifesto focused on the poor. There's very little in there, actually, to undo the welfare cuts we've had over the last 10 years, probably less than a quarter of the welfare cuts to be reversed. And of course, the main beneficiaries of the things that I just mentioned are those who currently are high-earning graduates, are older people who actually have some assets, and so on. So this is I think, a vision of a much more universalist welfare state than the one that we have. On the tax side, supposedly 80 billion of tax rises. You'll have heard the mantra that this is all on the top 5% and on companies. Of course, that's not true. You can't raise £80 billion in tax and only affect 5% of people. Two reasons for that. First, there are specific and actually very sensible tax proposals in there which would directly affect many more than the top 5%. So really way overdue changes to the taxation of dividends and capital gains, which affects many people, self-employed people, owners of small businesses who are not necessarily terribly well off, getting rid of the rather silly marriage tax allowance, which only affects people on relatively modest income. So that's one reason it's going to affect more than the top 5%. The other reason, of course, is if, as Labour say they want to almost double the burden of corporation tax, that in the end gets paid by people, shareholders, in other words, savers, workers or consumers. No one else can pay that. And I think the last thing to say about the tax plans is that whilst you can raise significant amounts in the way that they describe, I'm extremely sceptical of the idea that you could raise a full 80 billion a year in the way they describe. That's a more than 10% increase in the amount of tax that we raise at the moment. No other, I talked about other countries which have tax and spending as a fraction of national income close to the level Labour are proposing. Not one of them does it in the way that Labour are proposing on the tax side. They all have broader-based taxes. But actually, I think, despite those big differences between Labour and Conservatives on their tax and spending plans, I think there's one thing in common, which is actually we don't really know what they would do, because it's not, I think, plausible that within a single parliament Labour could do all of the things that I've just described and nationalise water, power, broadband, Royal Mail, and bring in their inclusive share ownership scheme, and, as I say, double investment spending and all of the other things that they're describing. So there's a list, an aspiration, which might be achievable over a couple of decades, but certainly isn't achievable over a couple of years. So I think actually with both Labour and Conservatives, one's left with a lot of uncertainty about what actually they would do in their time in government. Where would Labour's plans leave us in terms of the public finances? Well, on their own figures, borrowing would something like double to about 4% of national income. The national debt would be rising, and that's all assuming that the economy continue to grow as currently projected. But I think the big story here is a huge increase in the role, scope, and scale of the state, not just in terms of its tax and spending, but in terms of nationalisation, which would take more than 5% of private business assets into the public sector. A minimum wage, actually, which would directly set from Whitehall the wages of a quarter of private sector workers, so high as it's set relative to the sorts of wages that people earn. So a dramatically different view of the role of the state compared with the Conservatives, and a big change from where we've ever been. Finally, and I'll say something about the Liberal Democrats, too often perhaps forgotten in these discussions. The Liberal Democrat manifesto, as is often the case, sits somewhere between Labour and Conservatives. I think had the Liberal Democrats come forward with that manifesto in 2015, we'd be describing it as a really quite radical set of changes. Of course, set against where Labour is, it looks less dramatic today. But they are looking at, on top of, as I say, the 30 billion of additional spending already baked in, an additional 30-odd billion of spending. Beyond their Brexit policy, their biggest and most dramatic policy is on childcare, where they're looking at pretty much quintupling spending on free childcare for 2-, 3-, and 4-year-olds, and indeed for those over the age of 9 months where their parents are working. This will be creating a full new part of the universal welfare state. They've got also some significant tax rises, of which, again, the most obvious or high profile is a broad-based penny on all rates of income tax, which you guarantee really would raise you the 8 billion that they say it would raise you. Interestingly, the Lib Dems are the most fiscally conservative of the three parties. If you look at everything that they've promised, they would have lower levels of debt and deficit than the two main parties, to the extent, as I say, that one can take what they say seriously. But let me end by returning to what I said at the beginning, which is that there is a huge amount of uncertainty around all of this. There's a huge amount of uncertainty about where the economy would be and therefore what the public finances would do. But particularly, I think there's an enormous amount of uncertainty about what either Labour or Conservative would do in power, because I think on the one hand there isn't a Parliament's worth of action in the Conservative manifesto, and there's far too much in the Labour manifesto for it to be remotely plausible that they could do all of that in one Parliament. So I think the real question for both is, what would your actual priorities be if you did have the reins of government?
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to follow up on one thing because I think it might be helpful to people. You know, for those of us who've listened to you over the last 10 years or so, every budget, certainly in the austerity years, which are now over apparently, you were always using a certain amount of hyperbole about this is the greatest cuts to public services since when. We are now back to the level of the size of the state. I just wonder, when you talk about unprecedented increases in spending and taxes, that's certainly true for a single year, although you cast doubt on whether they could ever do it in a year. But is our perspective being a little skewed by the sheer extent of the cuts we've seen over the previous 10 years, or the squeeze, at least in certain parts of government? Or is this genuinely, if you were looking from a 50-year perspective, you would still say that this was an extraordinary change?
Well, if implemented over a Parliament, it will be significantly bigger, for example, than the increases over the most generous 5 years of the last Labour government, and they were really quite big spending increases at that time. So yes, I think and if you look at where it would take tax and spending as a fraction of national income, it would take them to levels we've genuinely not seen on a sustained basis, certainly in peacetime. Now, that's partly because, and I think this is an important sort of bit of background, the state spending today as a fraction of national income, despite the hyperbole about what we've seen in terms of austerity, is no lower than it was in 2007 after 10 years of Labour government. The state takes the same fraction, actually takes more, a higher fraction of national income in tax, and spends the same fraction of national income as it did in 2007. How can that possibly be when it's also the case that we've had significant real spending cuts since 2010? Well, three things create that. One is that we've had terrible growth, which means that there's much less to go around than we might reasonably have expected. Secondly, obviously the state grew very dramatically as a fraction of national income between 2008 and 2010 because national income fell so much and spending rose to some extent offset the effects of the recession. But probably most importantly in the long run, because spending on health is something like 25% higher than it was a decade ago, despite the fact the health service feels like it doesn't feel like it's got lots of money. All of that additional money for health has meant less money for everything for everything else. So the shape of the state has changed very substantially over that period. I think one of the most dramatic facts is that if you look at public service spending, back in the year 2000, about a quarter of public service spending, current public service spending went on health. It's now about 40%. And that is a big change over time. And that's one of the reasons why everything else has felt so squeezed.